idle air valve adjustments on 420 and 560 models. A lot of the time I get these cars in the shop where the idle speed is just way up there. Sometimes they're low mileage, sometimes they're high mileage, but I'll have either a 420 SEL, 560 SE, SEL, SEC, and the idle speed in park with no accessories is around 1,000 RPM. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, potentially, and some of them are academic and some of them are not so academic. So some of the veteran Mercedes techs who are watching this are probably going to give me a bunch of crap and say, oh, you didn't check this or you didn't check that. Well, under most of the circumstances where I've had to adjust this idle air valve, yes, I have. So here are the preferred prerequisites for adjusting the idle air valve. Prerequisite number 1, making sure you do not have any major vacuum leaks in your intake manifold. Now, why do I say major? Well, because a minor vacuum leak, such as a little vacuum leak at the throttle plate or a little tiny vacuum leak at an injector seal, is not going to cause you to gain an extra 300 RPM of idle. It's just not going to do it. But there are some things that you should be aware of before you do this. For instance, make sure nobody's taken the throttle control rod going down to the airflow plate underneath the airflow meter and lengthened it to force it open to make the car idle better. Please make sure of that. Also make sure you don't have any major vacuum leaks like the O-ring underneath the fuel distributor. And finally, make sure that you don't have something ridiculous and stupid going on like a bad OVP or a bad oxygen sensor and a disconnected oxygen sensor or a check engine light or something like that. Now, once we get all those things out of the way, I have been to my wits' end sometimes trying to get the idle down in some of these cars. I've had 560 SLs that have come in with an idle at around 1,000 RPM, 1,050 RPM, no vacuum leaks, we've resealed the intake, no fuel system problems, we've done our pressure checks, healthy working injectors, all of our sensors in the system are working, including the engine temperature sensor and the potentiometer on the side of the fuel distributor. So now that I'm done giving you all the caveats, we're going to talk about what happens to idle air valves. Yes, idle air valves on these models wear and they are adjustable, and this is the only idle air valve that has this problem. This does not apply to 380 and 500s because if you remove the idle air valve, you will see a little plastic cap. Now I have it removed. You won't see a little plastic cap or adjuster or anything like that. This is the idle air valve from a 420 SEL. In the end of this thing, once you remove the idle air hoses, there's usually a little brown plastic cap, or it turns brown from age. When you work it out with a screwdriver, you will see this threaded sleeve. What does this threaded sleeve do? Well, I saw this and I went, what does that do? Because I always wonder when I see something that I think, oh, that must be an adjustment. I always wonder what it does. Well, this 5 millimeter, is it 5? It's 5 millimeter by 0.75. It's a very fine thread. It may even be 5 by 0.5. I can't remember, but it's a very fine thread and I have a specific screw for adjusting it. Slides in and out. If you put a screw in here, then you get a little wrench and tug the sleeve out about 1 millimeter. Just 1 millimeter. We're not talking on a major adjustment. It'll bring your idle down by about 100 RPM, 150 RPM. So the adjustment's pretty significant. Likewise, if you go in, it'll bring your idle up. So if you go out too far, you can readjust it. Sometimes I have to adjust this a bunch of times. This sleeve, though, if you look really closely, you can see that the sleeve is flush with the housing. If the sleeve is about flush with the housing, you're going to get a slightly low idle of like 600 RPM or so in drive. And usually I like for it to be about 1 millimeter below the housing, the cast housing. So the sleeve needs to be in about 1 millimeter to 3/4 of a millimeter. And that'll usually give you a good idle speed. Now, why is that? Well, I think it's because the inside of the idle air valve wears as it has to work. You know, it's on and off, on and off. Because when you throttle the engine up, voltage to the idle air valve drops. It just opens. But what we've determined, what we've determined here is that a lot of the ones that are bad or worn will make like a little, there'll be like a rattling sound, and some of them it's louder, and this one it's not so loud. So this isn't necessarily a bad one, but by making this adjustment, you can get your idle speed back in the proper range. This is really nice considering that many of these cars are not within the proper range, and by now they idle fast. And what do some of the suppliers do? They clean the valve up, put it on eBay, and they sell it as a rebuilt valve. Yes, that is the rebuild. Adjusting the little sleeve. Do the valves ever go bad? Not really. I've had one bad idle air valve. And it wasn't even really that bad. It just, you know, didn't quite do what it was supposed to do. Okay, so now that we know how those things are regulated, remember, you need to make sure your OVP is in good working order before you start messing around with it, and your idle speed control relay. It's good to have a sub for those guys, or at least to do a voltage test to the valve. Your voltage should be like around 4 volts at idle, depending on whether or not you have your AC on or not.